Hello, folks. Welcome back to the Exchange. I'm really excited to be back here. For those of you who don't remember, I'm Nikhil Kalathal, and with me today is Zachary Christensen. Today's topic is about economic policy, whether mitigating inequality is more important than stimulating growth to helping America's economy. With that, I guess we'll get started. Zach, why don't you start us off?
Hi, everybody. Zachary Christensen here. I work at a think tank in the Bay Area, and I'm excited to take part in this. This is my first time debating here, but friends with Nikhil and Ben. So what I'm going to be talking about today is basically I'm going to take the side that it's more important to focus on growth of an economy rather than the equality. So let me just take you through a little bit of what we're talking about with that. So first of all, just to lay out the problem, is basically it's argued that wage inequality or economic inequality is a problem in the United States because it can hinder growth, it can cause lots of problems in the economy, it causes a lot of strife in the country. And basically what I'd like to talk about is that a lot of those things may be true, but I'd like to focus the talk a little bit on how inequality is, as a concept, isn't exactly hurtful. If you're looking at basic economic principles, inequality doesn't actually make one person poorer. I think a lot of the argument on inequality is based off of the assumption that money and the economy is based on a zero-sum game. In other words, if one person's making a lot of money, they must have taken that money from someone else. And I, of course, reject that assumption. I believe that if someone makes a lot of money, he isn't taking that money from someone else's pocket. He's basically increasing the economy. And in fact, I would even argue that one person making more money in a lot of ways can help the people that are in lower income brackets. What I've found is basically, and this is where the debate often comes to a peak, is basically when you're dealing with equality, it's a balancing act between equality and efficiency. So anytime you're focusing with programs that encourage equality, a lot of times you're hurting the efficiency of an economy, and a lot of times you would hurt the GDP. And on the other side, if you want to increase the efficiency of an economy, a lot of times you have to ignore equality. And that's kind of been the two sides of the coin, and that's what we'll be talking about today as well.
Great. Well, thanks so much for that perspective. To give a little bit of my perspective, I absolutely actually agree with you that I do not believe the economy is a zero-sum game. I don't think that when someone makes money that it necessarily comes at the expense of someone else losing money. However, I do think that so in that system, some level of inequality is going to occur, or inequality is going to occur, and it is going to be natural. I think the problem comes when those systems of inequality and the people who are not, or who have more, get entrenched into the system. And there are tracks for keeping the rich richer and keeping the poor poorer, and that there's very little mobility from one end to the other. Second, I would also reject the premise that when one person makes more money, he is increasing the economy and helps people in lower income brackets. I think that there was a recent OECD study that kind of addressed that issue and basically published a lot of findings that trickle-down economics and this whole idea that just growth alleviates inequality is not really shown anywhere in any data at all. And given that, I think that you kind of have to take a second look at this question and ask what is really the problem here and how do we go about solving it? Because if it's not just a zero-sum game, I don't necessarily think that redistribution is the answer or anything along those lines, but I do think that this has become a deeply problematic issue where inequality really has become entrenched structurally to the point where alleviating it seems impossible, and that causes a lot of inner turmoil and tension in a country, making progress pretty difficult. So I guess to sort of begin this debate, I'm going to do this sort of in a sort of moderator format where I'm going to pose a lot of questions to you, if that's okay. And I think I want to understand more about what you mean by economic efficiency, because I'm intrigued by this idea of a trade-off between efficiency and equality.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, basically, the trade-off there is you have to go to just basic microeconomic principles that anytime you redistribute wealth, for example, with taxes or with any kind of a price restructuring, you're basically going to have those three dirty words, those three dirty syllables that any economist hates, which is deadweight loss. You're always going to be hurting the economy's efficiency in a way. In other words, there's a chance you're hurting the GDP, the total GDP of a country, when you do those things. That's a microeconomic principle.
That actually completely answers what the question I had. And I think that on that aspect, I do agree with you to some extent, that if you're going to solve this problem through a redistributive system, you have to have an extraordinarily effective and efficient government, which we don't have. We just fundamentally don't. We spend a lot of money on a lot of these different areas, and especially education, for example. We spend more money on education than a lot of other countries, and yet we rank much, much, much lower than those countries do. And so it seems like it's clearly not a question of just spending and taking money from top percenters and just giving it blindly to poorer folks. I guess the second question that I want to sort of get into is this idea of GDP fetishism. I think that when you think about growth and such, that GDP growth is a really, really valuable and powerful metric for tracking how well a country is doing and the quality of life in that country for developing countries. However, I think that once you get to a developed nation and to a first world country, that just looking at GDP growth doesn't really paint a complete or clear picture at all about what's actually going on in that country in terms of how people are living and the quality of life and the progress of the technology and infrastructure within that country. And in some circumstances, a year of 2% GDP growth, where you do a lot of kind of, I'm not kind of completely sure what to call it, but basically supporting building up infrastructure of sorts through various spending policies or various saving policies, but basically things that don't correlate immediately to growth could in the long run really jumpstart growth later. And so I'd love to hear your perspective about that.
Yeah, well, I agree with you on that. I mean, every country is in its own place as far as growth goes. There's some countries like the U.S. where, like you said, 2% is pretty much as good as you're going to get, maybe a little better than that. There's China, who's dealing with 6 to 8% growth every year. I mean, they get upset when they have less than 6. So, I mean, each country's in its own place with that. So you're right. It's not a very reliable metric to say whether it's the right time to redistribute wealth or not, or to create more equality. Yeah, did that answer your question?
Yeah, sort of. And so just to expand a little bit and I guess relate it back to this equality issue, I think that what's really problematic with focusing on GDP growth is it sort of gets to an analogy with where the stock market focuses too heavily on profits, for example. So when a company is demanded to kind of keep growing its profits year after year after year after year, despite the fact that they're doing pretty well by all normal standards, but they need to hit that 10% margin, at some point they start having to cut some essential services that they're providing to their employees. Maybe it's healthcare, maybe it's cutting the wages a little bit, maybe it's shipping some jobs overseas, and stuff like that. And so I wonder, from your perspective, do you think that this focus on hitting this 4% growth number or making sure that the country is growing at a fast rate and not a sluggish rate has perhaps some of those unintended adverse side effects where the focus on just growing it for the sake of growing it comes at the cost of addressing things like inequality in ways that you could do without redistribution, but you would grow at a slower rate?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. I mean, that's really the big problem with the free market is, the tragedy of the commons is that it's just not, I mean, no one's looking out for the little guy. And you're right, if there's so much focus on growth, in a lot of ways you're also sacrificing, like we were saying before, there's the trade-off, but if you're focused 100% on growth, you're going to be sacrificing a lot of things that have to do with, the quality of life, income. So yeah, that is a possibility, absolutely. So that's something you have to be careful of. it's always a balancing act with all of these. So that's why, I'm not Ayn Rand. I'm not going to say money is king and do whatever it takes to earn profit. But yeah, you have to constantly balance whether or not it's worth it for a country to establish more equality, because you have to understand the cost of that often is a slowing in growth of GDP.
Right. And so from my perspective, I think that really what needs to happen to fix this inequality issue is somehow addressing these. Basically, the way I view it is that if you look at a spectrum of incomes, where here is high incomes and here is low incomes, and in the middle is everyone else. You have a wheel on either side of this spectrum. And if you get into this wheel towards the right, you get into the higher income group, and you can stay there, and it perpetuates for generations. And the absolute inverse is true for the lower income group, where if you get into that wheel there, it perpetuates, and your family is poor forever. And so I don't know if you agree with that perspective, so let's start with your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely something that happens. You're talking about wage mobility or economic mobility. Is it?
But I think it's more than just wage and economic mobility. It's things like education and, even human capital development about, I can go home and I can talk to my PhD educated mom and dad versus going home and being in a foster home or having your parents in jail or something like that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that would be my main point of all this, is that maybe it's time to not focus on inequality, but focus on what you're saying, focus on human capital and things like that, making sure that there's education, there's equal opportunities education-wise, not focus as much on the dollars and cents of the inequality. Sure. So I would agree with you on that. Yeah.
So it seems like economically speaking, we're on similar pages about how we view and understand inequality. And so I guess perhaps a point where we might differentiate is the impact that inequality has on a political system, perhaps, where I think that in the current situation, in this current level of inequality, it's pretty apparent that a portion of the population has greater control over the policies that are implemented. I think there was a Princeton study done pretty recently that showed how Congress really doesn't respond to the preferences that people show, but respond to outside pressures and outside sources. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's one of the dangers that's something we're seeing an increase in as we're seeing all of this inequality just explode. We're seeing more and more financial pressure or donations with politicians. Mm-hmm. That is a problem. This is just my opinion, but I don't believe it's gotten to a point where it's become a huge danger. I think that huge inequalities can be very dangerous politically for a country. You see with the French Revolution, I think that would be the extreme. You can see it overthrow entire countries and sovereignties, but I don't think we're really anywhere close to that as far as we see it. I believe that...
Well, I would disagree with that, but I would also be more interested in knowing how you then go about evaluating when you're at that point. Because it seems like, the French Revolution comes about and it just hits suddenly. And I don't think that we want to get to that situation. Ideally, we want to catch the signs of getting to that point before a French Revolution happens here.
Yeah, absolutely.
So what do you do to then notice when it's at that dangerous point or that tipping point?
Well, this is a good question, because I think this gets to the root of the problem. I think what we really should be looking at with inequality is the middle class and is the majority of the population, are they taken care of enough that they're happy? Can they eat? Can they work? You got to keep them happy. And what we've seen,
it seems like our middle class is really struggling right now, isn't it?
Well, it depends on how you look at it. If you look at the real numbers that are adjusted for inflation, the middle class is basically, their wage has stayed constant for the last 20 years, so it hasn't changed. If you look at the wages for the top earners, for high income people, it's just exploded. It's ballooned. Right. So that can be frustrating to watch,
But then doesn't that mean that a middle class family has less spending power relative to the rest of the population than they used to?
No, not really. Actually, it's because we're looking at how much they have. It doesn't, from what I understood at least, that's not how I understood it to work. But what we see is it stayed about the same, adjusting for inflation. And what that means, and even if you look at it, in a lot of cases, there's a lot of cases that can be made for families and households actually having more spending power now than they did 20 years ago, simply because of technological advancements.
Sure.
The quality of life, it can be argued, is a lot better now than it was 20 years ago.
Absolutely.
I mean, that's something that even though dollars and cents doesn't really match, you can see just in the quality of life with the way that we've had. If you think about Google and advancements like that, it's really improved our lives a lot. Mm-hmm. It's made some people just obscenely rich, and we haven't seen a dollar of that, but it's improved our lives a lot. And I think that the quality of life is what's really...
There's all these intangible elements that contribute to your quality of life that don't get captured in an inequality spectrum that actually probably would indicate the middle class is doing a little bit better. But, for example, if you look at the recovery from the most recent recession, most of the jobs that have come out of that have gone to either lower class jobs or to very high class jobs. And that kind of middle sector of jobs has really hollowed out. I think if you want to know more about this, there's a New York Times graphic that does a pretty excellent job of showing how they redistributed jobs to different areas and such. And so,
absolutely. Yeah. I saw that too. That's something that's definitely happened. It is a little scary. The middle class it's lost a bunch. A lot of them have gone to the lower class. Some of them have gone to the upper class too. So
yeah, exactly.
I mean, that's the share. I mean, that's basically, you're just talking about the share of who is where. I don't know if that really affects the GDP. I mean, it could affect the GDP. I haven't seen anything that proves that it does, those shifts in middle and upper classes.
My hypothesis would be that in the long term, it does affect the GDP because, as I mentioned, I think that once you get into one of those groups, poor or rich, you get pretty stuck in those groups, and that there's very little mobility from one to another. I think, Raj Chetty has some studies that kind of support that point.
I disagree, actually, with that. I think there's quite a bit of mobility in the U.S., more than people think, and I actually had some stats on that. I read a study today about how the U.S., basically it does lag behind other countries as far as inequality goes, but it's still pretty comparable to other European countries. And as far as mobility goes, 70% of people will have at least 1 year in the top 20% of incomes, which is pretty dang good. So in their life, 70% of people are going to have at least 1 year where they earn that much income. 50% are going to have at least 1 year in the top 10%, and even within that top 10%, only 0.6%, or I'm sorry, 10% of people are going to have at least 1 year in the top 1%, and of that 1%, only about 0.6% get to sustain that amount of income for 10 years. So there's really a lot of movement, especially in that upper class, where you see, one particular year someone will be up in that 1%, but then the next year they're going to be way back down to maybe the top 10 or maybe the top 15%. So there's a lot of mobility that way. Intergenerational mobility, not as good.
Yeah.
But yeah.
And that was sort of my point, is that perhaps in a person's life they might see more fluctuations in terms of
sure.
where they are, but when you aggregate their income for their life, they kind of stay in one area, and then their kids are pretty likely to be in that area, in that same quintile that they were in as well.
Right. I think I saw somewhere that 50% of one's income is determined by your, how the standing of your family, basically.
Yeah, and also where you live and where you were born. Again, Raj Chetty has been doing some really amazing work about just exactly this question, showing how there are certain neighborhoods where if you live in that neighborhood, your chances of getting to the top 1% are much, much, much higher than other neighborhoods. And I think what's interesting about those studies is that they often place places like Santa Clara County where you have a very good chance of making it to the top 1%, but that's juxtaposed right next to, I think it's Alameda County in Oakland, where if you're in that county, you have almost no chance of breaking out of the income group that you were born with. And that kind of immediate juxtaposition seems to me a huge reason why we see such crazy political tensions and crazy arguments in places like the Bay Area, because you have a very, very, very wealthy class, an aristocratic class almost, right next to a poor class.
That's true. I agree with that. Yeah, I mean, I can't. That must be really frustrating, and I see it myself too. I am in Santa Clara County, but I'm not the 1%. Trust
Right.
me.
As researchers, I don't think any of us would be.
So I live what you're talking about. But it is frustrating, and that's I would urge people to try to look beyond that and just enjoy, just see the big picture as far as the economy goes. But
Sure.
where the danger comes up is, yeah, you're right. When people see the inequality like that and see that, hey, they feel like they never had a chance, that's the real danger in America, because we all need to have the American dream, or else it doesn't really jive too well here.
And so I guess, so we have about 10 minutes left. I think we should start transitioning to some potential solutions to the inequality problem.
Yeah.
I want to start with, I think that vocational training and community colleges need to be much, much, much more highly emphasized. I sort of completely disagree with the Sanders perspective that free college tuition is good. I think that not every kid needs to go to college. In fact, the majority of kids probably would be off better if they didn't go to college. And that vocational and training of that sort is really, really, really important and lacking in this country. So we'll start with that statement and then go from there.
I could get on board with that. I absolutely agree that free college for everybody is not the solution. Free tuition is, we're already seeing, it's already a bubble that's probably going to pop, and by the time our lives are over, just the education bubble. People are getting degrees in modern dance, which is great for them, but we need more people getting vocational jobs, like you were saying. Mm-hmm. So I agree. Like, we need to emphasize on developing human capital in the country, not equality. But if we emphasize human capital, the equality will happen eventually. It'll work itself out, or at least people will stay. I mean, the middle class will be happy enough that they don't care how much Bill Gates is making.
Yeah, and then at a broader level, I guess, do you see this issue as something that we need to really be worrying about intervening in right now, or is this something that you think that if we just let it run its course, it's going to kind of balance out in the long run, et cetera, et cetera?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, it's trending to more and more inequality, but if you look at quality of life, like we were talking about earlier, it's getting better and better. Yeah. So, I don't think it's necessarily that critical that we deal with this immediately. So I would advise to kind of take a step back from the ledge with a lot of policies that redistribute things and make more equality. I would say wait it out until we're absolutely sure that it's going to be a big problem.
Sure. But then how would you feel about sort of policies that actively seek to get people from lower income groups or lower opportunity groups into situations where they might get more opportunity? Almost like affirmative action, but I'm kind of hesitant to bring affirmative action into this. I'm thinking more along a system that is flexible and changes to kind of bring up people in the bottom group into opportunity situations that are available and provided by upper class citizens, perhaps. Because I guess to expand a little bit more about why I think this is important, I think that as you see these kind of ballooning of super returns to skills, super returns to scale sort of situations, and a congregation of enormous, enormous wealth in an upper class, it's really easy for this upper class to create kind of insulated bubbles around themselves that are fairly impenetrable. You see that there's another recent New York Times article about this that was actually differentiating between, I think it was the top 1% and the rest of that 1%, in terms of, if you look at a cruise ship, there are certain aspects of a cruise ship where the real 1%ers can get so much more out of it and get these incredible experiences that are inaccessible to 99.99% of the population. And I think when you have that sort of inaccessibility, that also comes with economic inaccessibility, and goes against trickle-down economics actively. And so I wonder about your perspective on that.
Yeah, I mean, you hear the saying over and over, it takes money to make money, right? And so the opportunities just the disparity in opportunities is vast. And, I mean, that's a problem too. I would agree with, I do support programs that, favor people that have a tougher upbringing. I do. I mean, it's treating people unequally in a way, but I think that's okay. I think it's important that everyone has a chance to at least go to college, or at least, make themselves a better person. And that's
Try and start that company that they want to start.
what's that?
Try and start that company that they want to start.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And that's why I think policy-wise, it's important that we focus that the government focuses on making it easier for small businesses, helping them to start up. I think that's the way to do it. Instead of creating more, or instead of policies to cut inequality down, we should be focusing on supporting those new businesses, because it's tough. You know, you need a lot of money to start those things. You know, we need to be helping. The government should be helping with grants and loans that are helpful with that type of a process. And I think that would really help the gap. Would help a lot of these people climb the ladder and get up into those higher.
And I absolutely agree with you about that. Now, I guess I want to take 1 second to just talk about an issue that I don't know if I have clearly articulated viewpoints on, which is sort of this estate tax kind of principle, where someone like Donald Trump can start a small business by taking $1 million loan from his dad and going to do that, whereas Joe Smith can't really do that. And so how should we deal with that sort of situation where just by virtue of having a wealthy parent, you can go start a small business so much easier than someone else can, and your chances of succeeding are so much higher because you can take bigger risks knowing that you can fall back on something. And I don't necessarily know if I support a really high estate tax, because you worked for that and you shouldn't be made to give that up necessarily. But at the same time, I think that there is a certain level of innate unfairness in that.
Yeah, I mean, it's way unfair. I mean, there's no other way to put it. It's extremely unfair. I mean, and you're right. I mean, Donald Trump can go out and buy a hotel, make millions of dollars off of his $1 million that he got. It's extremely unfair the way it's set up. But I draw the line at taking money, large amounts of money from someone who's earned it and just redistributing it. No, that doesn't really. I mean, it would fix the inequality problem, but what would that do to the American dream? What would that do to
it would fix the inequality problem at all? And I guess that's something that I also would love to hear your perspective about, which is I sort of take issue with. I absolutely agree that today our government is inefficient, but I kind of absolutely disagree with this perspective that innately governments have to be inefficient.
Okay.
And so, is there a way to build a kind of dynamic, innovative government agency that can effectively and efficiently manage redistribution?
A government agency that manages redistribution?
In an effective, efficient manner.
Efficiently?
Yes.
No, I mean, from an economic perspective, redistributing is inefficient inherently. It would destroy all of the motivations that we have to work harder to get more things.
But I'm not sure that that's completely true, because when you look at countries like the Netherlands and such like that, I think it's a different sort of attitude where the rich buy into the redistribution system because they have a sentiment that if they fall, they'll be taken care of. Whereas here in America, it's sort of, oh, I don't want to give you anything because I earned this myself. And there's that's sort of like a cultural divide where in these other systems you see these redistributive systems working more efficiently because people, I guess, believe in more commonality maybe. I'm not 100% sure. And I guess I kind of do agree with you where like a direct one-person to one-person redistribution is not really what I was talking about. I was talking more about, taking $1 million from someone who makes $10 million and building a bridge somewhere.
At aggregate levels, yeah. Yeah, I mean, that is something I would be against it personally, and I think that I truly believe that there's enough opportunity in our country as it is that the people who want to make things happen for them, they have their opportunities to do it. It's easy for me to say because I grew up, in middle class already. It's good for me. So I don't know. I'm sure some people would take offense to that, but I truly believe that everyone has that ability, and I think that if we redistribute in the way you're suggesting, that could erode some of that a little bit. It could erode not what I'm saying. It could erode what the people that have earned that have been working for. And I think you don't want that sentiment in the country as well. I think that's an important driving factor. That's how I see it, at least.
Cool. So I'm just going to give my closing thoughts, and I'll hand it over to you to give your closing thoughts. Broadly, I really do think that economic inequality has become a deeply entrenched, hugely problematic issue in our current day. I think that the poor get poorer and the rich get richer, that there are very few avenues intergenerationally for poor people to go from being poor to becoming rich. So in some sense, I really do disagree with what Zach just said, that if you just work hard, you have an opportunity to find your way up. I think you can look at things from payday loans to the price of bulk toilet paper to all of these little things that add up to make being poor really, 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 really expensive, where living as a poor person is much more expensive than living as a rich person is in a lot of ways. And I think that that is at the heart of the inequality question, that being poor should not be more expensive than being rich, that if you're poor, sure, there is some natural inequality in the economy. I absolutely agree about that, and that there's going to be a spectrum naturally. But we should be looking out for the people who are at the bottom end of that spectrum and trying to do as much as we can to help them improve their lives, however they can do that. And I'll turn it over to you, Zach, for closing comments.
Yeah, I appreciate your thoughts a lot on that, and I'm right with you in a lot of that. It's true. It's not fair. From my perspective, though, I feel like maybe a lot of people need to just. I think as a whole, we need to give up the goal of trying to be completely fair. It's not going to be fair as long as it's a free economy, which is unfortunate, but it is the way it is. I also agree with you, though, that it is extremely frustrating that we don't have the opportunities that rich people have. That's something that can be troublesome. It's something we have to keep an eye on. I don't believe that we're in a place where we can fix it right now, but it is something. So that's what I'd leave at, is that we're at a place where we need to focus on just growth, making sure that our quality of life continues to improve from year to year, from decade to decade. And as long as that's happening, the 1%ers can get as much money as they want. I don't really care. As long as we're doing that, we're good to go.
And just to clarify, it has to be aggregate quality of life. It can't just be mean quality of life that can be skewed by someone just getting an even nicer house, you know?
Exactly, yeah, and not even just the middle class. It needs to be, yeah, you're exactly right, And yeah, even cutting out one, look at middle and lower class. As long as their quality of life is improving, I think.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for listening. We'll post the relevant articles as usual, and I hope everyone has a great night. Thanks so much, Zach.
You bet.